In Everywhere You Don't Belong, a young boy becomes a young man on Chicago's South Side. But even though the star of Gabriel Bump's debut novel is Claude McKay Love, his life is shaped by the people who love him and the people who leave him.
I thought that a character like Claude was something I wasn't seeing a lot of in popular culture, and was a character that I thought could be interesting. He's this exceptionally kind and sweet kid. I think he's exceptionally empathetic.
In a recent essay, Bump calls that place the spectacular average, the middle ground that gets overlooked and undervalued when headlines define your home. Bump saw that firsthand as a young man growing up in Chicago's Highlands neighborhood, where the novel is set. The Highlands is filled with beautiful, historic homes, but in the novel, when police kill a young boy who is feeding his neighbor's cats, it becomes consumed by violence.
I feel, and have always felt that way, right, about South Shore, that it is not only misunderstood, but misunderstood in this kind of grotesque way.
Bump spent 8 years turning Claude's story into Everywhere You Don't Belong. Now he's navigating the life of a new novelist, like seeing his book reviewed in the New York Times and meeting the fans who love it.
What most affects me, I guess, is hearing parents talk about their usually young son, right, because of what the book is about, right, like a boy coming of age. But children, saying how much they love reading and how much they hope their child loves this book and thinks that they will. That's cool.
Gabriel Bump, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, yeah, thanks for having me.
So you've started your tour really just last week. You're kind of getting a feel for how this is all going out, and the reception's been fantastic. The reviews have been great.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, it's hard to know what to expect, right? So I'd say it's unexpected, but I didn't know what to expect. And I think particularly when the New York Times review came out, on publication day, by an author I really admire, Tommy Orange, reading the book and talking about the book in ways that I hope someone would, some people have, but on that stage, it's kind of otherworldly.
Yeah, I was thinking that. What's that like as a first-time novelist, starting that to read a review? I mean, that has got to be so nerve-wracking.
It's exciting to see it out there, right? It's terrifying. I still kind of get chills when I could go into a bookstore and see it on display. Right, I kind of sheepishly touch it. I think I'll get over that stuff soon, but it's only been about a week, so it's all pretty fresh.
What's it been like to meet readers and fans?
Well, yeah, the extent to which I do have fans, I'm still not sure.
Still building your base.
Yeah, still building the base. No, but going out to readings and doing, especially afterwards, doing the book signings, have remained probably my favorite part about all this. Even before the book came out, we were just doing conferences with the advanced copies, just sitting in convention centers, with lines of people, just wanting you to sign their book. That's a feeling I didn't expect I would be so cool and I would love, but I think it's the best part.
What do you like about it?
What I kind of most affects me, I guess, is hearing parents talk about their usually young son, right, because of what the book is about, right, a boy coming of age. But children, saying how much they love reading and how much they hope their child loves this book and thinks that they will. That's cool.
The story's told through the eyes of Claude McKay Love, who, one of the things that a lot of reviews have pointed out and that you've talked a lot about, and which I really liked as a reader too, is he's not special in any other way that people look for kids to be special, especially coming from, as you said, to a rough area. he's just a kid who's just trying to find his way.
He comes from a stable family, right? Like he doesn't have total like economic pressure to behave a certain way. I think that's something that might be a little lost when maybe even when I talk about the book, but when the book is read, is that a big part of this is like Claude having the solid like economic and familial like grounding underneath him, where he's allowed to just be an average kid, right? And how can he do that and be happy, right? When society might not want him to be.
Right. He experiences a lot of loss, but there's a solid thread of love throughout his life, and you always get that sense as a reader, like he matters very much to his family. There are people watching out for him.
Particularly because his parents leave, right, when kind of one after another, when he's very young and ends up being raised by his grandmother and her longtime friend, right, and who
was like family.
Who was like family, right?
Paul,
who has lived
right.
with her, Paul, who has lived with her for a while, and they take it on themselves to make sure that Claude like turns into a special person, right? And I think that what I liked about how the book turned out and was kind of surprising to me when I was writing it is that when Claude ends up ultimately, not being special, right? Like not being exceptional the way that they might have wanted him to when he was younger, and maybe like starting out high school too, that their love doesn't fade, right? Like there's just this real genuine connection and love between all of the nuclear characters that I think is important.
Where did the similarities begin or end between you and Claude? What did he grow out of, or what made you want to tell his particular story?
So there aren't many similarities, right, between me and Claude. I think that, we both grew up in South Shore on the same street, Euclid Avenue. We both wrote for our high school newspaper, right? I went to college in Missouri, just like he did, to study journalism. And that's about it. And I think that what made me want to write about a character like Claude is because when I was in high school, and this led on to when I was like in college and kind of taking writing seriously and messing around with these characters. But there was something interesting happening in Chicago from like my point of view, right? I felt like Chicago was being portrayed on like a national scale in these like two extremes, kind of what I was talking about like earlier. Right? Like on one extreme, this was when like Barack Obama was running for president, and we had like Michelle Obama right on this side, like even like taking charge in a lot of ways. And she spent most of her childhood on Euclid Avenue, right south of me. And then on the other side of the spectrum, like I talked about earlier, this was when violence was really spiking in Chicago, particularly South Shore. Right, there was hundreds, a cascade of murders and violent crimes, right, and mostly involving young men, right, like mostly involving kids that were my age in high school, just getting killed for nothing. And I thought that like inspecting kind of the middle ground, like the average, where Claude was more how I felt like in all this. Like I didn't view myself as an exceptional teenager, right? Like I didn't have to like settle into a life of crime, right? And I feel like there were a lot of kids like me, and that was probably the initial impulse where I thought that a character like Claude was something I wasn't seeing a lot of in popular culture, and was a character that I thought could be interesting, and I think like turned out interesting, right? Because even if he's not exceptional in traditional ways, I think he's like exceptional in ways that society might not value as much as they should. Like he's this exceptionally kind and sweet kid, right? Like he's exceptionally empathetic, and those those qualities drove me towards Claude, I think, drive the book.
In the novel, as you mentioned, we see Claude's neighborhood erupted in violence, and it's a spectacle for news cameras, and yet it's his home. And there's beauty there, and there's loyalty there, and there's love, and as you said so often, that's what gets missed.
You know, I feel, and have always felt that way, right, about South Shore, that it is not only like misunderstood, but like misunderstood in this kind of grotesque way, right? Like people just view it as this predominantly black neighborhood, like on the south side of Chicago. Like, but like a lot of neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, there's some social and economic diversity within it, and those dynamics, right? Like I think are interesting and are somewhat explored in the book, right? Like Claude, Grandma, and Paul live in kind of the swankier section of South Shore, which maybe to an outsider wouldn't view it as swanky, but these internal dynamics, like how that powers the relationships around everybody, I think is interesting.
And when you grow up in an area that the world sort of looks at as tragic, there's always that choice for you when you become a young adult then. Do I leave? Do I stay? And often the pressure is, go, get out of here.
Yeah, and I think that I relate to it in different ways. You know, like Claude leaves Chicago because he's kind of feeling like disillusioned, like unfulfilled, particularly with what Grandma and Paul like want him to do, right? They want Claude to stay in Chicago, go to DePaul on the north side, and become a journalist in like the Mike Royko fashion, like in Chicago, this kind of a person that holds people to task, right? And I think Claude is disinterested in that, and maybe because he knows that he could never accomplish that, right? Like he knows his own limitations. I left because I wanted to try something different, right? I wanted to study journalism. And similar to Claude though, when I came down to Missouri, I miss Chicago like crazy, right? I think that for me it was a little easier. Like I had a car when I was down here, and I'd drive back to Chicago a couple times a month, if not more than that, right? Just to spend the weekend. And like the homesickness Claude feels is complicated, right? Because the place is tied into it. Like he misses his home, but he misses these people so much, and I hope that the readers miss them too, right? When Claude goes in the second part, like I wanted there to be that kind of homesickness. That's why I thought it was important also for Claude to leave, because some kids that grow up in those areas do leave, right? They do venture out, and then what does the world look like to them? I think it's important to talk about, right? Like what the world outside like Chicago or St. Louis or New York, whatever, looks like to kids that are kind of born in this bubble and then are suddenly thrown into the heartland.
Do you remember when you first started to think of yourself as a writer?
It was probably when I joined the high school newspaper, somewhat on a whim, right? Like I needed another class. And there was something in the structure. I think the teacher, Wayne Brasler, was, Connie Stove in the book, this like grizzled, old, veteran and someone that just believes in the importance of the fourth estate, right? That journalism is a vital, like someone that's spirited. Like he was our advisor, like Mr. Brasler taught our school for a while, and something just clicked, right? Like I could meet deadlines. I didn't have much problems like hitting word counts, right? Like I kind of liked the intensity of it, like working on deadline days.
In the
right?
moment.
Like, just in the moment, like having to get rid of those 50 words, having to add like 50 words. I think that's the way I think about it now as being influential, is that I still somewhat write using word counts. Like I do word counts per day, and then how to make that as economical as possible.
One of the things that reviewers have really pointed out is the dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that is pretty intentional. Like the style, at least from my perspective, is pretty intentional. Right? Like I read a lot of plays. I watch a lot of TV with subtitles on. Like it is a skill to get people to like talk in a rhythm and trying to get each line to accomplish like multiple things at once. You know, there's a lot of technical stuff I consider when writing dialogue. But I feel like in this book too, a lot of the humor is in the dialogue, right? Like I don't think Claude necessarily notices or thinks like many funny things. Like the humor is just in people delivering lines at the right time, right? I feel like that's like dialogue is kind of optimal, right, for making people laugh. And I like think dialogue is important, right? There's like a reason that there's some like most of the page is just like dialogue, right? I think that it can read really well. And you know, I love writing. It's kind of the most fun. You have these people like talking in your head, like back and forth. I think it's kind of funny.
You were talking earlier about what a thrill it is to have your book reviewed, your very first book by the New York Times. But the reviewer, Tommy Orange, an author as well, said something very interesting, I thought, is that this shouldn't be taken as a political book. But what did you think of that? It's
well, I think that, I mean, I agree in some way, right? Like I would like this book to be taken, first of all, as a coming of age story, right? Like set in a certain part of the world. Like I don't necessarily think that it has to be a black book, right? I don't think it has to be a book about politics in the pre-Obama years, right? Or the social, racial, economic relationships in the pre-Obama years. Right? I think that all those things are included in the book and are important and give the book like heft and urgency, right? But I would like people to just like Claude, right? To fall in love with Grandma and Paul and Janice, and I hope that they would do that no matter you know, where they lived, like what color their skin was.
because there's so much power just in a story.
Yeah, and I think goes back to my initial impulse, right, of just showing these people that are exceptional in non-traditional ways, right? But everything else, you know, it's important to me, right? I think it's important to the book, right? But the main thing that I think gives it a universal quality are those characters.
There might be a kid who picks this up and sees a window into something that they could never have experienced.
Yeah, and that's what I think at the moments where we get a lot of history layered on top of each other are important. Like those are like meant to be educational, right? When the riot happens in South Shore and we get a section with Paul describing, you know, the riots in Harlem after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the riots in Chicago in 1968 during the Democratic National Convention. I feel like that history, you know, some of us just kind of know it, right? Like growing up, like one example I say is that like I grew up on 69th Street in Euclid, and 71st in Euclid was Emmett Till Road, right? And so Emmett Till was a name I saw almost every day of my childhood. I remember at a really young age saying, well, who is Emmett Till? And then getting the story from my mother, right? And so I think some of us just receive history in different ways at different speeds, right? And I think that kind of comes through in the book and how it's explained.
Tell me about your upbringing and your family in Chicago. As you said, you grew up in the same neighborhood as Claude, but different factors.
So I grew up in the Highlands where Grandma, Claude, and Paul live, right? A little bit separated from the rest of South Shore. And my parents were a biracial couple, so my dad's white, my mom's black, and they moved to South Shore, at least the story goes for me, it's because that their story as it's told to me, not for me, but that they initially, when they wanted to move to Chicago for work, they wanted to find a house in the suburbs. Like my dad grew up in a suburb just outside Chicago. But when my dad would speak to realtors and they'd say, okay, like this house is available, and then would bring my mom to say like the signing or another showing, suddenly the house wouldn't be available, right? And so they ended up moving like into the city, into a black neighborhood, right? And my dad was one of the only white people, I would say the only white person I saw on a daily basis just in my neighborhood growing up. And the Highlands are interesting because, you know, they're these nice like houses, right, that are in the South Side that are kind of like upper middle class, right, but are affordable, upper middle class looking, right, but are affordable and would anywhere else in the city be worth a lot more. But since they're on the South Side of Chicago, they're pretty affordable houses for people to move into. And, you know, I grew up in a similar way to Claude, like with a lot of stability at home, with a lot of like emotional and economic stability at home. I didn't really have to get in trouble, even though I did get in trouble like every now and then, right? And yeah, so that's kind of my family.
Someone was always watching out for you.
Yeah, someone was always, and I mean the love, I guess, is similar to Claude's. Like I had really caring parents, or have, you know, really caring parents that are still kind of cheering for me and with me every step of the way.
And for your dad, what was that like for both of you growing up, having that strong bond as a father-son, and yet so often a parent can say, well, when I was, you know, but yet he was looking at a much different scenario or possibilities for you. What was that like?
Yeah, looking back, like like there's some stuff, you know, like some examples, like when I'd go anywhere with my dad, nobody would believe he was my dad. Even now, I think, you know, like we actually have the exact same face, but, you know, I have a way different skin tone than he does. I'm way darker than he does. But my dad never really tried to pretend like he could tell me certain things about growing up looking the way that I do in Chicago. Like one memory in particular was probably like a real first experience with actual like racism that affected me personally. Was I was dating someone as a high schooler, and her parents didn't want her dating me because of how I looked and where I lived. And I remember thinking that was really unfair, and being heartbroken by it. And my dad didn't, you know, he said, I'm sorry, but he didn't really try and talk to me about it. Like my mom was the one that kind of explained to me that sometimes life's just unfair to us, right? And I would also say that one of the first and probably only times that I've seen my dad like crying, right? Like when we were living in the house, was when there was a really tragic shooting in our neighborhood that involved a young boy, like a toddler. And this was when I was in high school, you know, just one of these senseless, kind of reckless acts of violence. I remember coming home and him telling me that, and you know, just crying, telling to me. And so I think that, you know, growing up in a house with that kind of empathy, like around, really affected me, right? And I mean, my parents started dating not long after, you know, anti-miscegenation laws were outlawed, right? Like if they started dating probably, well, definitely a decade before they did, in certain parts of the country, it would have been illegal for them to be together, you know, and that was never lost on me.
How close it was in recent history, right?
Yeah, and how, you know, remnants of that can still exist, right?
So what is your life like now? You live in Buffalo, New York now?
I live in Buffalo.
Teach and write, or what's your typical?
So mostly I spent the last year just writing my second book, right? So I finished the draft of that, and then I did some teaching, and now I'm focusing more on, I teach at UB and University at Buffalo, and then a community nonprofit called Just Buffalo Literary Center, just doing like community community classes. They're often free for kids and some adults if they want to join. I live in a small house with a dog and a cat and my girlfriend Caitlin. And yeah, Buffalo, I think out of a lot of places I've lived, Buffalo kind of, this might sound hokey, but a place I belong, right? Like I really like Buffalo.
What's next for you? You've got another novel that's done already, or?
So the first draft is done.
What's that about?
So that is, it's a little different, right? It's set in Western Massachusetts, and it is about a group of academics that try to form an underground utopia, and what that looks like, and how that works and doesn't work.
Before we go, what's been the best part of all this for you?
Yeah, doing stuff like this. It's very fun. Yeah. I know I'm just starting, but traveling around, talking to different people about the book, talking about the process, getting to do readings, getting to visit places I haven't been in a while. Not a lot of people get to do that, especially, on the company dime. So that's pretty cool to me.
You were talking about the feeling of seeing someone hold your book.
Yeah. I don't think I'm ever going to get over that, right? So that's, I think, beyond the best part of it. Seeing someone like standing in line wanting you to sign their book, I hope that feeling never goes away.
Gabriel Bump, thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was really nice.